we'll catch up with my barking friends later in today's story. So this is day 9 of my 2,000 kilometre cycle around northern Spain. I'm at about 700 kilometres and I'm going to be ending at about 770 today. I'm heading for the city of Friol. So when I was planning this route months ago, I realised that I'd be following the Camino for quite a lot of this section of it. And I decided I didn't want to do that all the way to Santiago. So I decided at this stage I'd go up into the mountains. The other reason I had going up to the mountains was I wanted to visit at least a couple of Neolithic sites in Galicia. It's fairly famous for them. And I spotted there was a dolmen that was about, I think, 60 kilometres off route. So basically for today and tomorrow I'm doing this quite long diversion up into the mountains, really into the foothills near Lugo, and visiting the dolmen and then heading on there to Santiago de Compostela. So for the first section of this route, this is the Camino route, but it's also the Eurovelo 3 route, and both of those will continue to head all the way to Santiago. However, I'm turning off here, and at this point Eurovelo 3 is going straight on, and it does this big loop. It's basically following the river valley down and around, and I rejoin it in about 2 kilometres up this road, but in the meantime it will have done about an extra 15. So basically I was cutting those 15 off. That did mean I was in for a fairly substantial hill climb, but it was nice, it was sunny, everything was pretty good. The Camino route itself, at this point, splits, I think, into a couple of alternatives, and one of the alternatives is running up here as well somewhere, and we will see there'll be figures emerging from the mist. So the mist, this is mist, not smoke. Yes, as I was coming up out of the valley, I could see the mist was quite thick ahead, and I was going, oh, that's going to be fun. Fairly used to those sort of conditions from the Atlantic in Ireland, though, so I didn't panic. But it was really quite a strange morning. We can see some walkers there as I'm passing them, because it would be bright and sunny, and then suddenly you'd be back in another thick patch of mist. And as you'll see in a moment, at times it got really, really, really thick. In fact, so thick that I couldn't really see more than, I don't know, maybe about 30 metres or so ahead. So we'll see one of the worst patches of that coming up. But lots of beautiful clearings as well. So yeah, here we go. Going to get pretty bad here. And I think at one stage I actually pulled over because I could hear cars coming behind me and I wasn't sure if they could see me. So I thought, okay, whenever I hear a car coming, I'm going over to the side of the road, letting it past, and then I resume. Anyway, here we're back on the Camino route and we're heading down to where I'm going to be splitting off it, and I'm basically heading across a very rural area of Galicia indeed, while the Camino route continues on in a more direct line to Santiago. So here is my splitting off point, which is also the point, thankfully, that the mist lifted, and instead I've quite a nice sunny section. So here we are going through rural Galicia. This isn't the tourist route at all, and there's 2 side effects to that. The first is that the cafes and restaurants and all those features that are very handy if you're following the Camino route, they're literally, I don't think you can go more than 10 kilometres anywhere without one. They vanish almost completely, and as you'll see as we go through this cycle, I didn't really come across any spontaneously. Now, I'm sure if I'd got Google Maps out and searched in a locality, I was probably never more than 3 or 4 kilometres from somewhere. But if you want to recreate this route, I would say make sure you've water and at least snacks with you, because there's not that much as we go along it. What we see instead is a lot of this farmland and then sort of agricultural related industry, the sort of warehouses and things we're seeing scattered along the side here. And of course, that was one aspect of the reality of travelling through rural Galicia, but the other aspect was the dogs. So yesterday, when I took my lunch break, if you looked at the photographs, I had a photograph of a dog walking away from me. It appeared to be a fairly large Labrador or something. And I took that because actually it wasn't a Labrador. I saw it and I went, oh, that's quite a big, funny looking dog. I wonder what it is. And so I took a photo of it. And it did bark at some cyclists who passed, but otherwise it seemed to be behaving itself. But I was to see this type of dogs again and again and again, and today I run into them 3 times. And what I think they are is, I think they're a form of livestock guardian dog. So the mountains, which are mostly to the northeast as we come up here, the Cantabrian Mountains, they've got wolves in them, and they've also got bears in them. And I presume previously the range of those animals would have been even greater. So there's a kind of a solid reason, if you have a herd of something, to have dogs that will guard that herd from unwelcome intruders that might see them as a snack. So that's the dog I kept running into. And when we get to the ambush, and there's no better word to describe it that I experienced, I'll talk a bit more about them. But you see a lot of cyclists. Dogs are a big worry. When I was in Crete years ago cycling, a couple of big farm dogs charged me, and I panicked on the bike and actually ended up on the motorway as a result. So they are a problem. Here I did manage to find a snack. There's a cafe coming up. The only food they had was a little chicken tapas, but sure, that kept me on the road. And so here we are coming up to my first dog encounter of the day. So this is where I was just looking at the map, and a dog came out of a house and started barking at me, and that's the back of it walking off. And I thought, oh, that was like that dog I saw yesterday. But the second one is coming up here, and it's a much more interesting one. I'll talk you through it. So when I get to the outskirts of this village, what happens is there's two large kind of collie type dogs, some sort of herding dogs, spot me, and they start barking at me furiously. And so I it's hardly even a village, it's a small hamlet. So I slow down a lot, and I'm kind of going, are they going to attack me? But they don't seem to be. So here they are coming up to me. They go behind me. I pull in here to have a look at my map, and what I didn't notice until I looked back at this video is as I pull in, one of the collies, here he goes, he's passing me. Now where's he going? And the other one is staying behind, and he's still barking at me. And then I go forward. I put this in slow motion. I come around the corner, and lo and behold, now I'm in trouble. Now, as you probably understand, that lasted a lot longer than that time. I only took my phone out when I knew they weren't going to attack me, and there we saw the two dogs coming out again at me from the side. Got away. I stopped there, and I was stopped a good minute with them barking at me like that. And then I slowly left the village cycling, and then two dogs coming up beside me, and a little bit scared at that point because they arrived suddenly at my head height, and I didn't realise they were kind of coming there. But again, they didn't actually touch me. And I think from following lots of discussions about how to deal with dogs, that's generally the most sensible approach. I mean, if you spot them coming a long way off and you're moving fast, sure, maybe you can just outpace them. But generally, fleeing is a bad idea because then they will chase you, and they may well end up pulling you off the bike or something. It depends on how badly they're trained, basically. So with the livestock guardian dogs, because I had multiple other encounters with them, and I got quite used to it by the end, and I kind of figured the way to understand what they were doing was they had a job to protect either a space or livestock. You'd come along, so they'd create a huge racket to let everybody know there was something they didn't recognize that were there. And I would basically, at that stage, I would talk to them and I would say, yeah, well, Pero Bueno or something, which is kind of good dog, in the hope they might recognize those words, but also so that they would recognize me as a human, and presumably, unless they're terribly trained, therefore something they shouldn't take a chunk out of. And once they'd had a few seconds to customize to the fact I was there, I would slowly cycle away from them. And so that generally would work, because as I would cycle away, they would mostly just stay stationary and bark at me, or they would sometimes keep pace with me and bark at me. And again, in terms of what they're actually trained to do, that makes a lot of sense, because basically, if they're with a herd or whatever, something arrives that they're not sure about, so they make lots of noise to notify people that there's something here, they don't know what it is. The noise gets the thing moving, and then they just make sure it leaves the area. And yep, I didn't get bitten, so I could claim it definitely works at that point. And there was never really a stage once I got used to them, and they're hard to get used to because they're so big, and they're generally not solitary. Often if you run into one, you're running into two or three of them, and in that case I'd ran into an ambush where I the three of them in front of me and the two collies behind me. So like it's intimidating, but it didn't stop me cycling. It did perhaps mean that if I was coming up to a village and there was a road going through the village, little musical interlude there. That was the natural sound of the forest. Yeah, if I was coming up to a village and there was a road going through the village, but it was possible to divert, normally by staying on the main road going around it, I would often do that because I'd be like, okay, there'll probably be dogs. I think I'll be okay, but I really don't want to deal with it. The other feature you had was when you were going through very rural areas where typically there was maybe some sort of farm dwelling every kilometre, you would hear the dogs barking in the one you were passing, and then down away far in the distance at the next one, you'd hear the barks being picked up, and then maybe beyond that you would hear that again. So you'd have the realisation that there was probably going to be multiple welcoming committees as you went along. So this is me arriving at my lunchtime food stop. I had spotted this in advance. It was the only restaurant that was absolutely en route. It took me a second to work it out, but it had a menu del dia, which basically means you get 3 courses for a very cheap price. I think it might have been somewhere in the region of €8. And that 3 courses includes water, coffee, and a bottle of wine. So this was the second time this had happened to me on the trip, and actually in Galicia it's quite common in the kind of basically in the cheaper restaurants, when you order wine you don't just get a glass of it, you get an entire bottle. You kind of drink whatever you want from the bottle, and then that's it basically, the end of the meal. The first time it happened I was imagining, oh no, does this mean I'm going to be ripped off and the whole meal costs €6.50? I think that one might have been €8. But the other thing was that when the dessert arrived, I noticed with the other tables, they were putting, with dessert, they were putting an entire bottle of brandy down, and then people were helping themselves to a shot from the bottle of brandy. Now, in my case, this was a really warm day. It was, I think it was probably hitting 28 or whatever, which is the sort of temperature I start to go, ugh, I'm not really enjoying this at. I had a long cycle. I was still another 20 kilometres or so further to go, so I was not keen on laying into that wine at all. I think I just kept to a single glass, in fact. I've stuck a couple of those music from the forest little audio segments in because while my habit of shooting time-lapse photography does make it possible to cover an entire day of cycling in a reasonable period of time, this one will be about 17 minutes long, one of the things you do lose when you do that is the background sound levels that are happening. And one of the real pleasures of cycling in rural areas like this is the bird song, particularly if you're doing it in May or June, which is pretty much my favourite month for cycle touring, both in Ireland and in other countries. So the thing you can't get as I'm going along here is just the soundscape that's all around me. This was true for an awful lot of my cycling through Spain. Generally, the rural areas, the forests, all the rest, there was just a cacophony of noise. Unfortunately, I don't think I have a sample of it, but the other thing that I occasionally hit on hot days that was very impressive was, of course, the sound of the cicadas, I think they're called, kind of cricket-like creatures that do that sound, and you'd just be cycling through this and there'd be a thunderous sound coming from both sides of the road. So in actual landscape, what's happening here is I'm following 3 rivers that flow into each other, and they end up, and we've crossed it a while back, in the biggest of the river, which is the Rio Mino. The Rio Mino is the 4th biggest river in Spain. It's the longest river in Galicia, and it basically is flowing down from the mountains and then across to the Portuguese border, and actually forms the border for about 50 kilometres or so. But that's today's cycling, was basically cycling up and across these 3 watersheds that were all flowing into each other, and then this final hill going up and then down again. So here I'm getting quite close to Lugo, which is this town, and we come across this very small hamlet, which is notable for 2 things. One is it gets its name because it has a Roman milestone here by the church somewhere, but the second reason is that suddenly I'm very, very briefly on the Camino again, and if you look at this clip really carefully, you'll see there are a couple of walkers in it, But this is the Camino Primitivo, which is the oldest of the Camino routes, and that's coming down here. So there's multiple Camino routes. The one, when people say the Camino, they generally mean the French Camino route, which is the one I was on. But here I had accidentally come across and was doing a couple of 100 meters of the Camino Primitivo. And the interesting thing in terms of the days that are coming is once I got to Santiago and I was then cycling north up to the coast and then along the coast and occasionally dipping into the mountains. As I was doing that cycling, now and again I suddenly realised that there were lots of walkers all walking the same way, generally against me in this case, because I had hit one of the other Camino routes. There's an English Camino, the Camino del Norte, the Camino Primitivo, and a lot of those within them have some alternate bits you can walk as well. And I think it's not that surprising my cycle travel route, the cycle travel are the people I use for route planning. Great, I thoroughly recommend them. It's a website. You basically just put your own where you want to go in and it plots a route out for you. It's probably not that surprising it was picking routes that happen to be Camino routes because, of course, that gives you quite long off-road sections that are somewhat cyclable. They're quite rough, but it's also giving you quiet roads. And the big advantage, of course, of it doing that on the Camino routes is, as I've said, that's where you're going to find your cafes and your restaurants, and also I suspect that's where you're probably going to find much fewer aggressive farm dogs because they'd be barking at people all day, so the owners are more likely to be keeping them in or away from that. Anyway, here we are coming up to where I'm staying for the night. Hope you've been enjoying day 9. If you do, please give it a like. It helps me get out to more people, and if you haven't already, do subscribe to the channel. If you check out my Instagram account, which is also called eBike Touring Life, you'll see that as I do these cycles, I post live photographs literally as I'm doing them. So you can sort of keep up to where I am now much more quickly on Instagram. YouTube always takes me quite a while to edit things together. And the other thing I keep telling people is do check the comments and the video description because you'll find lots more information there. Here I am arriving at the town of Friol, so this is where I'm staying tonight. This hotel, Casa del Gaboni, ran by a lovely old woman with an enclosed yard to park your bike. This is the breakfast the following morning, and I got a pizza in a restaurant in the town itself before going to bed and setting off for day 10.